Hello everyone, how are you all doing today?
Good morning.
It's good to see your shining faces on a Saturday morning. You all look great. Wonderful. Well, welcome again to our second week of the Latino Leadership Institute's Public Policy course. We're so excited to have you. How are you guys doing? Are you all for real good? I'm a little concerned.
Coffee.
Oh, I hear that. Anyway, so this week we are thrilled to have Dr. Carlos here with us, and we're going to be covering public policy, obviously housing policy. You can tell I need coffee too. I'd like to introduce Dr. Carlos here. I sent you all his bio because honestly, if we did justice to all the work that this man has done, we would be here for the 2 hours. But we want to get on with things as well as honor this wonderful contribution that we have from this professor. So just to highlight a few things, he is a researcher with Centro, has done a lot of public policy around immigration, also works at Columbia University in their political science department. A political scientist by training, has also done a lot of publications that you can see the wonderful lists around immigration, Puerto Rican communities, even religious experiences and political activism. Truly a wide scope of things that are so relevant to our community. So we are thrilled to have him here to highlight the importance of housing policy. One quick note for you all is we will be distributing the PowerPoint, so please don't feel frantic with all of that. And we look forward to this wonderful lecture. And also for those of you who are here to talk to Jaime, he will be in the back. So look for him afterwards. He isn't missing. He's just going to be in the back so we can keep focus going here. And to the board members who are here, thank you so much. Your support is truly appreciated because no one in this organization makes any money. Truly, I can vouch for that. I don't make any money, but that's okay because what we do out of love. It is truly a labor of love, and having our board here on a Saturday, having the director here on a Saturday really shows our commitment to you. So we appreciate your commitment to us by showing up on a Saturday and our commitment to the community, all done on a Saturday morning, which means a lot. So without further ado, here we go with housing policy.
How are you all? Great. First of all, I wanted to thank the Latino Leadership Institute for the invitation to have me here this morning. And to be able to share this knowledge that I have gathered with you. I know that this is something of not just of intellectual interest to you, but actual personal interest because it affects you greatly, it affects us all. I like to thank Jaime Estados in particular for extending the invitation. I like to thank Cindy for the effort of getting me organized and bringing me here this morning. And let me tell you a little bit about format. I have a lot of information to share with you. A lot of it is numbers. I know that can sometimes be overwhelming. So what I will be doing is pointing out exactly the numbers that I would like you to focus on. You will be able to see all the numbers in details when you receive the PowerPoint presentation. In terms of format, I will entertain, while I am doing the slideshow, I will entertain questions for clarification. So if there is something that is not clear, if you need me to explain that, raise your hand, I'll address that. If it's a question if it's a substantive point you'd like to make, we will have that discussion towards the end of the presentation. That way we can just get all the basic facts, and then we can talk about substance and policy, etc. Okay? We will likely break some time about 11 o'clock so we can stretch out and just refresh our minds, take a break, short break, 3-4 minutes, not longer than that. There are bathrooms as you leave this room. There are bathrooms immediately to the right on this same hallway on the right, so you don't have to go too far. Feel free to walk out and come in as you must, and that's pretty much it. So let's get it. Yes. Yeah. Good. Thank you. So housing in New York City. Shelter is housing is one of the basic needs for human life and survival. If you review any book or website on survival, shelter comes out as one of the most important priorities people have, sometimes even before procuring food or even water. Many of the survival resources tell us that in extreme conditions, a person can live 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, but only 3 hours, that should be 3 hours without shelter. 3 hours, not 3 days, 3 hours without shelter. We can die of exposure very quickly. Yet shelter is not an express constitutional guarantee in this country. The U.S. Constitution does not guarantee such a right. The Constitution of the State of New York does not guarantee such a right. The Charter of the City of New York does not guarantee such a right. There is both case law that has established that access to emergency shelter is guaranteed. For instance, this case, Callahan versus Carey, based on this article of the New York State Constitution, the aid, care, support of the needy are public concerns that shall be provided by the state, was used to make sure that homeless people received emergency shelter. But the Constitution does not expressly state it. It came as a result of case law. There is also positive law, laws that are actually provided. The only article in the state constitution that refers to housing, it talks about the fact that the state is empowered to provide housing, but it does not guarantee it. Right? There are, however, laws, positive laws, laws that have been created, but these have been the result of advocacy and lobbying on the part of the people to push governmental institutions to make accessible to individuals and families the opportunity to escape exposure to the elements. Okay? So again, advocacy and lobbying have made these laws possible, and they will continue to do so. Okay. All right. Housing is nevertheless a critical social and political issue, and while this may not be express constitutional guarantee to housing, maybe there's not such a guarantee, government does occupy a great deal of its attention and resources on providing housing for the population and ensuring that its provision is one of quality. As a result, there are laws, rules, and regulations, such as these ones, that deal with due process in the acquisition of housing, anti-discrimination laws, laws that guarantee due process in the process of eviction and foreclosure, as well as regulations and laws on the livability of housing. Some of you may be aware of the warranty of habitability. This is a regulation that is very important. So even though there is no express right in the constitution of the country, the state, or even the city, there is case law as well as positive law that do guarantee a lot of these rights. What are the conditions, what are the current conditions of housing in New York City? And I'm going to be making use of the Housing and Vacancy Survey. It's a survey that is produced every 3 years by the U.S. Census Bureau, contracted by the City of New York since 1965. It is the most reliable data on housing in New York City. Okay? And this is the presentation that I'm going to be making on today. So, what do we have? First of all, we have, you know that we have over 8 million people in New York City. These 8 million people are formed into 3.3 million households, right? And of these 3.3 million households, almost 2/3 live in rental units. Less than 1/3 live in the units they own, right? Which is interesting because if you look at rental versus ownership opportunities in the country as a whole, the proportions are inverse. About 1/3 of the population lives in rental housing, 2/3 own their homes, roughly. That has changed a little bit as a result of the Great Recession that we just passed, right? What is also interesting is that out of this housing stock that we may have, I'm sorry, these are housing units, 3.3 million units to accommodate those 8 million people. 164,000 units, 5%, are not available for sale or rent. Okay, these may be units that are under construction. Some of them may be undergoing construction. Some of them have just finished construction but still not available for rent. Many of them are seasonal housing, or many of them are pied-à-terres, meaning second homes that people have in the city. Okay? So nearly, out of these 164,000, about 40% of them are these secondary homes that people occupy every once in a while. And because of the preponderance of the rental market in New York City, the bulk of this presentation will be on the rental market. Okay, you know, I will touch upon ownership a little bit, but the bulk of it will be on rental housing in New York City. Latinos, you know, we said that 68% of the population of the city are renters. Latinos are definitely overrepresented among the rental occupiers, as well as non-Hispanic class, right? So we depend on the rental market, overwhelmingly. And we can see it in this proportion when you compare 68% versus over 80% for Latinos and 74% of non-Hispanic class. Right? Another way of seeing it is if, for instance, Puerto Ricans represent 9% of the city's population, only half of Puerto Ricans would be represented as owners, and they're definitely overrepresented in this category. Okay? Again, it's about overrepresentation. Latinos are overrepresented in the rental market. In terms of households, we said that there are 8 million inhabitants in the city, right? But 3 million households, which means that for every unit of house, you know, these 8 million people are organized in so many households, about 2.6 people per household. So a couple and perhaps a child plus. But however, for Latinos, which represent, for Puerto Ricans, almost 9%, for non-Puerto Rican Hispanics, 20%, so about 29% of the population of the city is Hispanic. But only about 24% of the households. Why that lower number? Because there are more people per Latino household than in the city. Our families are larger. So we have more people per family, per household, than the population as a whole. African Americans similarly. African Americans and Puerto Ricans specifically within the Latino group approach the city average in terms of family composition, right? But non-Puerto Rican Hispanics definitely exceed it, right? There are more people per Latinos than the city as a whole. Okay. What type of housing do we have? Well, these are all forms of housing, rental housing in New York City. We have rent control, rent stabilized, Mitchell Lama, in-rent, public housing, HUD, and then we have the unregulated market. In terms of definitions, we know what public housing is, we know what rent control is, we know what rent stabilization is. In-rent refers to properties that were formerly private and the city has taken over because they have been abandoned, they have been neglected. The city takes over its management or property and manages throughout. Sometimes it transfers them to third parties to manage. But this is pretty much another form of city-managed housing. And then we have the unregulated market. So Most people live, 46% live in stabilized apartments, nearly half. Another 38%, 39% live in markets that are not regulated, right? But 9% live in public housing. So these are the three main categories of housing for people in New York City. Now, if we look at how it breaks down, we can also see by borough how it breaks down. So if rent stabilized is the most common form of housing, it is certainly most houses in the Bronx are rent stabilized, less in Brooklyn, about even in Manhattan, less in Queens, much less in Staten Island. In Staten Island, they're mostly unregulated. Okay? How does it affect different ethnic groups in the city? Where do we live? For Latinos in general, similarly, if 46% live in stabilized housing, most Puerto Ricans and other Latinos live in this type of housing, rent stabilized. And the second category is in unregulated rental apartment units, right? Puerto Ricans less, but Latinos slightly less. Puerto Ricans depend heavily on public housing. African Americans, we have similarly. They depend on rent-stabilized units, followed by unregulated market units, and they are also heavily dependent on public housing. Okay. The size of apartments. We have established that Latinos in general have larger households. Means we need more housing, bigger apartments, more bedrooms per apartment, particularly for non-Puerto Rican Latinos, right? Which correlates greatly with immigrants. So immigrants tend to have larger family composition, right? But what is the availability of housing in New York City? 41% of all rental apartment units are one-bedroom apartments. 40%. That is followed by two-bedroom apartment units. Three-bedroom apartment units are 16% of available housing. And studios are about 9%. Right? What is interesting is that if you look at by borough, in Manhattan, more than half the units are studios. More than half the units of housing are studios. Most of the 2 or 3 bedroom three bedrooms or more apartments are in Brooklyn. About a third are located in Brooklyn. The Bronx, which tends to be a heavily Latino county, is overrepresented in terms of the Latino population, has a fairly even distribution. The Bronx had about 18% of all housing units, all rental units in the city. They have about 18% of one bedrooms, 19% of two bedrooms, 20% of three bedrooms. So it has an even distribution of this type of housing. But again, the Bronx is a heavy Latino borough. It's a heavy immigrant borough where we tend to have larger families, larger houses. So that is something to consider. We move a lot. 36% of the population of the households in New York City moved in the previous 5 years. This is data from 2011, by the way. The next survey is being conducted in 2014. It will not be ready, the data will not be ready until next year. So this is data from 2011. So from 2006 to 2011, just a little bit over a third of the population moved, right? African Americans moved a little bit under that proportion. Puerto Ricans did as well, but a little bit higher rate. Hispanics, other than Puerto Ricans, moved at 40%. So significantly higher than the city as a whole. Asians did so as well. Okay? Most of the people, they did not necessarily move from abroad or from other places in the US, they moved from within New York City. So African Americans and Puerto Ricans move heavily within New York City. Those that move, roughly 30% of Puerto Ricans and African Americans that move in the city, that moved over the past 5 years, did it within the city. To a lesser extent, non-Puerto Rican Hispanics and Asians. Why is this? What is the reason why people were moving? Most people think it is because they have a job, X or Y. No, housing. A third of the people that move because of housing. And if they move from within the city, as opposed to coming from abroad or coming from somewhere else in the country, 42% of the people who move within the city did it because of housing. Housing is a primary reason why people move within the city. Housing is such an important reason to move in the city because it is scarce. There are fewer available units. Since 1965, as many of you all know, if not all of you know, the city has been under a state of housing emergency. It has been on a state of housing emergency illustrated by the vacancy rate, the number of rental units available for rent, which is under 5%. 5% of the housing stock.
Since
1965. So, for the city as a whole, the vacancy rate is 3.12%, way under the 5%, which is the standard used to declare a state emergency.
Does that mean the population has been growing steadily?
The population, since 1965, the population has been going up and down. It decreased during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It began to increase since the 90s. So has the housing stock. It's not just the population. We also need to talk about the number of housing units available in this period of time. Because if the population declines, but the housing stock is also declining in numbers, well, you still are going to have a tight housing market. And that happened through the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. If the population increases, but the housing stock stays the same, then we have a worse vacancy rate. If, however, the housing stock increases at a faster rate than the population grows, then we could have more room to choose from. Okay. All the boroughs have a high vacancy rate for Staten Island. And where do we find the more scarcity? Vacancy rates are lowest or most scarce among the rent-regulated units. Rent stabilization compared to unregulated apartments. So 38% of available housing is stabilized, as opposed to 55% of unregulated rental apartments. We have a lower vacancy rate in rent-stabilized unit than in unregulated apartments. And when you have apartments that are available for rent in private condos or co-ops, there is no housing emergency in that market. But for the rent-stabilized unit, there is. And this is because most rent-regulated units tend to have comparatively lower rents. The lower the rent, the more scarce the unit is. So, for instance, the vacancy rate approaches 1%. Only 1% of units are available when rent is under $800. Yeah, because everybody wants to get a unit that is that cheap, right? So the more people vying for those type of units, the fewer units like those are going to be available. When the rent is $2,000 or more, we approach 5%. Still under the housing emergency benchmark, but there are definitely many more units at that level. Okay? Supply and demand. This is a question of supply and demand. The supply of housing and the demand for housing. Okay? How much does it cost to rent an apartment in New York City? $1,100 on the median number. So the way they add this median number of contract rent is that they add up all the rents in the cities, and at the halfway point, they establish the median. And they find that around that midway point, $1,100 is the rent for the city. Yes?
This factors in both unregulated, regulated.
All rents. All rents. There's a difference between contract rent and gross rent. Gross rent includes, for instance, if you are supposed to pay for utilities, that's added in this number. Right? Like some people may have an air conditioner they have to pay for, well, that's added in this gross rent. Contract rent is just to rent the unit. How are these rents distributed? By borough. The contract rent is lowest in formerly private property that is now managed by the city, in rent housing, at the bottom. $350 per apartment. But imagine the conditions of those units. And some of you may have experienced the housing conditions in those units.
Oh, he's right. Yeah.
The second lowest category is public housing rent, with a median contract rent at about $450, which is nearly half this number, a little bit more than, a little bit less than half, right? About a third for people who live in rent housing. Right? In unregulated units, is $1,369, or for co-ops and condos, $1,400. Okay? I mean, of course, if we go to Manhattan, you have almost $2,500 in rent. Okay? The Bronx overall has the lowest median contract rent in the city, on average. Okay? Again, tends to be a district, tends to be a borough where we are overrepresented. By housing size, in fact, I'm going to skip this slide and move to make another point. A consequence of this scarcity is that households are often doubled up. More than one family must live in the same unit. And this was the case in 10% of the houses. 4% for doubled up houses that have another family in them, or nearly 5.5% when they have a secondary individual. For about 4% of households, this number, we have another family living with them. And this consequence of scarcity affected African Americans and Hispanics disproportionately. Remember, Latinos that are not Puerto Rican represent about 20% of the houses in the city, but 30% of those that are doubled up. And if in the entire city, 4.4% are doubled up, but 30% of Latino families are doubled up, that is 7 times this rate. You multiply this by 7, you get that number. So we Latinos, non-Puerto Rican Latinos in particular, are definitely way, way affected by this scarcity representing doubled up houses. African Americans, about 5 times the rate of the city as a whole. These are for people that have other family members living with them. these secondary individuals, these tend to be roommates, right? Which is why, for instance, you have non-Hispanic whites at 48% represented in this category. But even for the city as a whole, 5.5% have another individual that is not related to you by blood or marriage living with you. It is the case for non-Hispanic whites. It's still double the case for African Americans, and 3 times the case for non-Hispanic Latinos. This is as a result of scarcity. Okay? We also have about a little bit less than 1% of households captured in this survey that were formerly homeless families, or households that included at least a member of the household that was formerly homeless. 25,000 households. Okay? And again, if you look at African Americans, that is the case of 27% of those households, or 16% of Puerto Ricans. I'm sorry, got it wrong. 47% of African Americans, 27% for Puerto Ricans, 16% for non-Hispanic Latinos. Again, another way in which we are disproportionately affected. Scarcity contributes both to overcrowding and the deterioration of the housing stock. I made allusion to the fact that in-rent housing has the lowest rent. They also have some of the worst housing conditions. And I'll show you in a minute how that is. But in terms of people living in houses that are deteriorated, either because they have an incomplete bathroom or kitchen, because the apartment is dilapidated, because they have 3 or more deficiencies or 4 or more deficiencies, right? We have that for the city as a whole, 8% of the units, of the rental units, were physically deficient. They had poor physical conditions, right? For African Americans, it was 13%. For Puerto Ricans, it was 12%. For non-Hispanic for non-Puerto Rican Hispanics, 11%. Again, slight over-representation of our folks living in this type of housing, these types of conditions. In terms of the type of housing where these conditions take place, nearly 1/3 of the in-rent housing units are physically deteriorated. 17% of the public housing units are also deteriorated. Now remember, public housing is 8% of the housing stock of the city. 17% of those units are deteriorated. That's a problem. Now, how do you combat scarcity? You add to the housing stock. And since the 1980s, about 16,000 units have been built on average, with ups and downs, right? So in the past 5 years, it peaked at about 26,000, then it came down to about 15,000. The city has attempted to meet the need for housing by increasing the supply of units. This is an analysis that the Independent Budget Office produced recently about the former Mayor Bloomberg's housing plan marketplace, right? They said in 2003 that they were going to achieve 165,000 units. That they were going to provide new housing units to the market. In fact, they came under that amount. Not too shabby a result. No, they came close. They came to about 95% of their goal, right? But in terms of The goal, most of it was because the units were existing but in bad conditions. They were got rehab. They were rehabilitated. Only about 55,000 units were new construction. So the city added about 160,000 units of new housing. Good thing. It was mostly existing housing stock that was deteriorated and was brought up to condition. It added another 50,000 units that were newly built on land that did not exist, on land that was empty, that was vacant. Right? Now, most of the housing that was built of this period, 165,000 units or slightly less than that, went for people who made low income. And we will talk about what low income is. We will talk about what affordable housing is. Don't worry about it. Most of it went for people that make less than 80% of the area median income. What is defined, what is legally defined, or rather administratively defined as low income, right? You have another segment that went for people making between 81 and 120% of area median income. And you have another that made 121 to 180% of area median income. They call that mix. So the bulk of this provision of housing, about 130,000 units, went for low-income housing. But many of them went not to the rental market. The bulk of this housing went for houses to be owned, for apartments to be owned. Right? That's not a bad thing. That is not a bad thing. However, it does not provide for the need in the rental market. We need more rental housing, but most of the units constructed went to the home ownership market. Why is home ownership not a bad thing? Because there are many people who are renters who could actually afford to buy a house at their current income. Even at this level. These people here can actually, if they were renters, they could actually afford to be owners, right? Given a number of conditions, right? They get out of the rental market, that rental market becomes available for other people who need rental units. It's not a bad thing. Home ownership is also positive because it provides people who can afford it, that's a good caveat, the opportunity to create capital. Capital that they can then leverage to achieve greater stability economically, social mobility for their children, etc. Okay? Home ownership is not a bad thing, but the greatest need in this city continues to be the rental market. Income. What are the definitions of poverty, extremely low poverty, or is low income, middle income, etc.? These guidelines are provided by HUD, the U.S. Housing of Urban, the U.S. Department for Housing and Urban Development. And it tells us that extremely low income households are households with incomes at or below 30% of the median family income, PMSA's primary metropolitan statistical area. It's a unit that the Census Bureau uses. It's a geography unit. For New York City, they tell us the primary metropolitan statistical area down here includes the city of New York, Putnam County, Rutland County, and Westchester County. So these three other non-New York City counties are included in the calculation of family income. Some people have a problem with that. You'll be surprised how close both Putnam and Rockland are to the income of New York City as a whole. Remember, if we only included Manhattan, we would have a higher median income. If we included only the Bronx, we would have a low median income. By including Putnam, Rockland, and Westchester, things tend to be evened out. Westchester looks more like Manhattan, Rockland and Putnam look more like Brooklyn and Queens, perhaps. Study that. Extremely low income households are those that are at or below 30% of the area median family income. That means that for a family of 4, if you make less than $24,000, less than $25,000, you are extremely low income. If you make less than $41,000, you are very low income. Now, these are categories established by HUD. HUD may not give you the exact number. It gives you the criteria, 30% or below of median income, 50% or below median income. This changes every year. This changes every year. So for instance, in 2013, these are the different categories. These are for the extremely low median income. Okay? So if you are a single person and you make $18,000 a year, you are extremely low income. If your family has 8 people and you make $34,000, you are extremely low income. Moderate income. If you make $136,000 and you have a family of 8, you are moderate income. If you have, remember, in New York City, the average household has 2.6 people on average. So if we go into this category, between 82,000 and 93,000 is considered moderate income. So when we talk about affordability, we need to understand what it is we're talking about. Okay? The area income, the median income for New York metropolitan area is $63,000, meaning that half the people in the metropolitan area make 63,000 up to 63,000. The other half make more than that. Right? Now, for a lot of people in this room, 63,000 sounds like a lot of money. Right? If the median contract rent is $1,100, that is $13,000 a year that goes to rent alone. $13,000 leave $50,000 out of your gross income in the metropolitan area. Because you'll do a lot with $50,000, right?
Not after tax.
Like feeding children. I'm sorry, missed that?
Not after tax.
What are some of the agencies? What are some of the agencies that deal with housing in New York? Right? You know, we talked initially that there is no constitutional guarantee to housing, yet there are many laws and regulations that are established to manage housing in New York City, New York State. The first one is, you know, I will refer to as HUD. HUD, however, I'm going to set aside for a minute. I'm going to talk about the state agency, the New York State Homes and Community Renewal. This is a new state agency. Governor Cuomo just created it. He created it to bring together this alphabet soup of state agencies. Excuse me. These are some of those agencies in that alphabet soup. We have the Affordable Housing Corporation. We have the Division of Housing and Community Renewal. We have the Housing Finance Agency, which includes the Housing Trust Fund Corporation. We have the Municipal Bond Bank Agency, the State of New York Mortgage Agency, which includes the Mortgage Insurance Fund. A lot of these agencies are about finance. Why? Because whether you buy a home or you rent a home, the property needs to be built. It's built with money that you borrow. And these are many of the agencies, if not all of the agencies, that deal with that aspect of it. Specifically, this mega agency, Homes and Community Renewal, deal with, on the one hand, finance and development, housing preservation, community renewal. We have the low housing tax credit, tax-exempt and taxable bond finance program, single family and capital awards. It's about money. We have housing preservation. DHCR, we'll talk about it a little in a second, has the Office of Rent Administration. They manage Section 8, they manage asset management, and the Modernization Assistance Program. If you want to replace your windows, they assist you. If you need to insulate your home, they give you assistance for that, right? They also engage in community renewal through managing the New York State Community Development Block Grant. These are federal assignments, money the federal government gives to states, and it is given through these agencies. New York Main Street, Affordable Housing Corps, the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, and Neighborhood and Rural Preservation Programs. These are the different areas that this state agency deals with. Yes?
Can I just repeat back to me? So part of these agencies are, federal grant programs that are just being administered by the state?
That's right. Others are managing state funds. Usually, many of these agencies manage, this is a state agency, and they manage state and federal funds. Section 8. Section 8 is mostly federal funding. Mostly federal funding. But it is managed, because HUD is not going to manage. HUD delegates to state agencies or city agencies to manage these functions. Yes?
Which agencies help in regards to the people that are foreclosures of their homes?
You have HUD may assist, you may have DHCR, and depending on what type of help. If it's about due process, it may be the Attorney General's office. If it's about whether the bank foreclosing on the property is conducting itself responsibly or not, maybe the Attorney General's office. If it's because the state is taking over the property or a city is taking over the property because the homeowner hasn't paid the sewer and gas and the sewer and water charges or the tax, real estate property tax, that may just be the city.
A lot of people that were granted fraud loans
that would be the Attorney General's office. I suspect. Oh, that is the person that I would turn to. Yes, ma'am. Speak up, I'm sorry.
There's been in the news already about a lot of hostile takeovers where people actually pay 1% of what their homes are worth. It's been taken over, it's a widespread operation. It's been in the news. They pay like $15,000 or $40,000 home and lose their homes once they start moving for $15,000. Could you comment on anything like that?
I can, after we make the presentation, if you pose the question again, I'll make a comment on that.
All right.
Within that alphabet, sorry.
I just wanted to say that both the city and the state agencies have anti-foreclosure programs. The Department of Community Renewal and HPD also have
Right.
anti-abandonment, anti-foreclosure programs.
Right, but in terms of, we'll go through those. I'll present that in a second. So specifically the HCR, they provide supervision, maintenance, and development of affordable housing. Again, affordable housing is defined as low or moderate income. So anywhere from 30% of area median income, 50% of area median income, for moderate up to 120% of area median income. up to perhaps $120,000 for the next 3 years. All right? Oversight of public and publicly assisted rental housing. They administer rent regulations. Hey, rent stabilization, we know about rent decontrol, right? And rent deregulation, right? This is the agency, DHCR is the agency that must be notified when your apartment goes above $2,500 a month in rent, or you make more than $150,000 for 2 years in a row. If that is the case, and you are in a rent stabilized unit, that owner must apply to DHCR to get your apartment out of rent stabilization. But DHCR must be notified. Also, all homeowners in the city have to register either with HPD or DHCR. Certainly, if you're under rent stabilization, yes.
Is it automatic when you live in rent stabilized, that once that apartment reaches $2,000, that apartment is no longer rent stabilized?
So long as you continue to live there, the rent is under rent stabilization, provided you do not make over $150,000 a year for 2 years in a row. You can make 151 year and then 99 the next. You're still under rent stabilization. So it's a number of provisions. It's not automatic, and it has to be notified to the HCR, and you need to be advised of that. But you also need to submit evidence of your income, etc. Yes.
Can you go back to the income regulations? Are you saying that if you make over $100,000 a year,
150
your rent?
for 2 years in a row.
Your rent, no matter what level, whatever rate it is, can go out of control?
If your rent is under rent stabilization, you have a rent stabilization contract, and it usually means that the rent is $2,000. We have gone up to about $2,500 now. And you do not make $150,000 a year, your apartment will continue under rent stabilization. If, however, you have a type of resources, a type of job or whatever, where your income goes above $150,000 a year, the household, not your own income, the household income, goes above $155,000 a year for 2 years in a row, that apartment is subject to be removed from rent stabilization.
No matter what the rent is?
No matter what the rent is. I mean, presumably the rent will be under $2,500. Yes, sir.
What's the difference between rent control and rent stabilized?
Rent control is a remnant of World War I and World War II rent regulation. In World War I and World War II, there were restrictions on the amount of rent that could be, you know, the rate at which the rent could be increased. When we hit the housing emergency in New York City, it was established that homes that were built before 1947 would remain under rent control and pretty much frozen, not frozen, but the increase was going to be very small. Another category of housing was the housing built after 1947, but before 1971, right? So they were going to be protected under rent stabilization. And for some other units built after 1971, if they received some sort of governmental subsidy, whether it was a loan or a tax abatement or what have you, they will also be under rent stabilization. Okay? You have a question?
Yeah. Pardon if I'm confusing anyone or whatever. You mentioned that the problem now is the scarcity of rental apartments, particularly for those who are moderate or low-income families. Okay. Now, and you mentioned that one of the problems is the diminishing stock of housing, affordable housing, correct?
Not
yes.
quite.
Then you also said that when the when the rent exceeds, when your income exceeds the $2,000 to $2,500 in a rent stabilized place. Now, my question is, what happens to that apartment that becomes unregulated under the stabilized program? And what agency, I know it's DHCR or HHPD, who monitors all this? Because we know that the stock of stabilized housing and rent-controlled housing, including public housing, has been taken by investors, and they have been converted to high-level, high luxury income apartments, rental or whatever. And when you do this and you look at the income, more and more people will be displaced from these places. It doesn't really matter now whether it's Manhattan. How do you some sort of resolve this problem, this growing problem? It's going to grow.
Yeah, I think that you have answered yourself the question. I mean, the agency that manages rent regulation, as I said, would be DHCR, to some extent HPD as well, but mostly DHCR.
Is there something wrong with it?
Well, as I said, the issue is one of supply and demand. You were asking me what happened with rent stabilization units that are deregulated, and once they are deregulated, they make part of the unregulated market. So the landlord, whether it is an individual landlord or a corporate landlord, can charge whatever rent the market bears. So that's what happened. I mean, it's a question of the provision of housing, the number of housing units that are being built versus the number of housing units that are being requested to be lived in. Mr. Ruiz.
Yes. What happens when the landlord is the city itself, and now the tenant is making over $150,000? Then what happens?
Well, I mean, the city can be the landlord under a number of circumstances. It could be in-rent property.
I'm talking about like NYCHA.
Well, NYCHA, we're going to talk about NYCHA in a few minutes. There is a specific concern about NYCHA. The city does, NYCHA is a city agency, but it's an agency that is not necessarily subject to the same rules and regulations under DHCR or HPD. They have their own set of rules.
All right, thank you.
Regulated by the federal government. So, but I will address NYCHA in a moment.
Thank you.
There was another question. Yes.
Once the unit becomes deregulated, how does it become deregulated again?
It doesn't necessarily. One way, for instance, I will give you an example of Michelada. There are many rent-regulated units that are regulated under the Michelada program, right? They're subject to rent stabilization because of they're part of the Michelada program. Michelada program was a program to subsidize the construction of moderate income housing. And it was subsidized by these loans the state gave. Some of these agencies gave loans under the Michelada program to build those projects. They were subject to rent stabilization until the loan was paid off. Once the loan is paid off, the landlord can petition the state to get out of the Michelada program and deregulate those units. It may, but it doesn't have to. Oftentimes, a landlord has an incentive to ask for deregulation because they can ask for higher rents. But if the landlord decides to apply for another type of state subsidy, then the units will be maintained under rent stabilization. But if the landlord withdraws from that program, the state, I don't think, I'm not an attorney, but I don't think the state can mandate the landlord to stay within the program. Okay? But it must notify. It must notify the tenants, it must notify the state of its plans. Okay? I'm going to take 2 more questions before we take a quick break. So there was one question here and one in the back.
I just wanted to, a little clarification on the, rent control apartment. Is it true that a rent control apartment is controlled only until the tenant that was there is there or the succession rights are implemented with the family or whatever? Once the person or the family moves out of that apartment is no longer rent control, is that true?
It may not be rent control, but it may go under rent stabilization.
Okay,
It depends.
And,
And you're right, it is the person that lives there, the original tenant, or somebody who has succession rights to that apartment. But that is administratively or legally established.
Okay, thank you. With regard to the Section 8 affordable or moderate income, it is my opinion that when they implemented that incentive for the public, they may have had good intentions, but it's a program that is created for people to lie when they apply for this apartment. Because 30% of the income of a couple is not 30%, in my opinion. I count it as 60%. Because if I earn $40,000 and my partner earns $40,000, $80,000, so you automatically do not qualify for that affordable housing. That's the way I see it. And then when the children grow up, they still have to report that. So that still changes that 30% income. I think it was a form of getting rid of rent control apartments and rent stabilized apartments came in issue because when I used to manage apartments of Section 8, I figured that out because I did all the applications and all of that.
Thank you. One more question in the back?
I just simply want to know, there were rumors that they put that
I can't hear
program.
you. Use the microphone. I cannot hear
There
you.
were rumors. There were rumors that that program was coming to an end. Can
Which
that
program?
happen
Which
with
program?
HPD and the
I'm sorry, which program?
the program, the Mitchell-Lama program? Is that true? Section 8?
Some of them, not all of them. And it depends on the owner if they want to not continue or participating in that program. So that's what it is.
The Mitchell-Lama program it tends to be managed by the state. There may be some city involvement through HPD. So whether the entire program is coming offline or not, I cannot answer to that because it depends on what agency managing the program they're referring to. I don't think that at the state level it is coming offline. What may be happening is that many of the units that benefited from Mitchell-Lama subsidies are actually getting out of Mitchell-Lama because the program has run its course after the landlord paid down or paid off the mortgage. But again, because the landlord paid off the mortgage or the subsidy that it received. Okay? So let's take about a 3 or 4 minute break so we can stretch out if you need to run to the bathroom, go to the bathroom, and we'll reconvene in 3 or 4 minutes, okay?
You know what I'm saying? I was kind of way about that.
Well, we got special
Well, you get it. It's not like kind of like trying to make people like over here now. Then you want to right there. What? Don't play with them. No, I just think of the way I mean, people bring it down.
But I'm going to put my elbow on there.
Venir aquí la semana pasada me di cuenta, wow, vaya, más habla, quiero escuchar esta canción más. Sí, a mí, está interesante, aunque no opino con él que es solamente el sketch, porque hay muchas cosas que Aunque tal vez yo creo que una parte de eso yo no hablo siempre, a mí no importa que haya, yo no los voy a pero eso pero como es para mí vamos a ver, para que eso siga. No, yo sigo por el no voy a hablar. Testing.
So another agency that is important to the regulation and management of housing in New York City is the Department of Housing, Preservation and Development. And similar to the HCR, it has very many different offices and functions, right? It has an office of enforcement and neighborhood services, strategy and operations, development, legal affairs, etc., etc. Some of the functions that are of particular interest to us, and I'm going to highlight for HPD are this. The Office of Asset and Managed Property Management, that deals with in-rent housing. Again, these are formerly privately owned units, buildings that were taken over by the city because the landlord abandoned them, either physically or neglectfully. The urban renewal programs, the tenant interim lease, which is a way to get people out of in-rent and make them into homeowners. Many of the, I made a reference before about how the new housing that has been provided, either newly built houses or gut rehab houses, have gone into home ownership. It is because they have gone from in-rent property. It went from tenants to homeowners at a low income level and moderate income level. Right? They were not necessarily moved out of their property temporarily when it was being fixed or built, but they became homeowners as a result of the city programs. The Emergency Housing Services, which is an anti-homelessness prevention unit, and buildings that are at risk have not been taken over yet, but these are the ones that accumulate Class C and Class B violations constantly, time after time. The city comes to a point where it takes over. The city is very reluctant at this point to take over buildings. It actually phases out in-rent, and what it does is it funnels these properties to third-party transfers, so other non-for-profit usually, but not always, organizations manage these at-risk buildings or buildings that have been at risk to be a risk. Yes, sir?
The TIL program is TIL program is not as widespread as what?
The TIL program is what?
TIL program.
Yeah, what about it?
It's not a widespread program anymore.
It's It is the provision of, since there are not that many units left in REM, there's still a few, but not as many. And HPD makes an evaluation of the tenants in those units and determine whether they have the wherewithal, the financial wherewithal, as well as the skill to manage themselves as a co-op. For some units that is possible, for some buildings that is still possible, but for others it may not be possible, for whatever reason. But that's established by HPD. So as far as I understand, till the tenant entering lease is still an ongoing program, as far as I understand.
Educating the tenants would help. Educate the tenants,
That's right, that's part of the process. That's part of the process, yes.
What does TIO stand
Tenant entering lease.
You mentioned earlier that HPD doesn't really have incentive to take over property, so they often give it to a third party. I'm asking, is it possible, this is rhetorical, but is it possible for the third party to create an incentive for the city to take over that property and give it to them? Oh, thank you.
An incentive or an interest?
I'm not.
I mean, many of these organizations are dedicated to manage these type of properties.
Right. What I mean by that is, so I'm just curious to know, so the HPD enforcement or the NREM program, I guess I'm asking, with the current developments in the city, gentrification and the like, would that be an issue for a group of people in the TIL program, and maybe their building isn't running as smoothly? If they're in a heavily gentrified area, would it be a situation they would deal with? A third party giving interest or a reason to the city to take a building and give it to
Yes.
Okay.
But again, these third-party transfer organizations tend to be established organizations that have a relationship and a track record of having managed property previously.
Can they be development companies?
Pardon?
Can they also be development companies, or is that conflict of interest?
Can they be? I mean, there are development companies and there are development companies.
Okay.
They tend to be management companies more than development companies.
Thank you.
Okay, I think I understand what he's trying to say. I think the problem might be that a lot of these properties are going to people who are coming out of shelters. A lot of these properties are going to people who have really, really low income. And I mean, in my line of work, I see it where a lot of them have a really hard time paying rent. So it might become a cycle where these management offices are making money.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
And so I think that's basically what I understood.
And that is certainly one of the issues. There may be a segment of the population that has some intractable problems that cycles them in and out of housing, in and out of homelessness. But for some other people, it's just, it's the nature of the economic cycle, for instance, that places them there. Or maybe just personal circumstances, domestic violence, divorce and separation, that places them in those situations. So, we still have a population that is very poor, that cannot afford. If we go back, let's see how far back I'm going. These are the people who were formerly, these are households that include people who were formerly homeless before. And many of them, the median household income is $15,000. So these are people on the verge already, right? These are people who use a lot of, between 68 about 68% of their income goes to pay rent. 68%. So these are people who are on the verge of homelessness recurrently, right? So it's not because necessarily an agency that manages that property has an interest in just cycling people in and out. It's that these people structurally are in a situation where they are on the verge of homelessness, even though they currently live in private rental housing, or even if it's city subsidized. Yes, sir?
The percentage of housing, what is it, public housing or?
No, these are for, all people in New York City. These 25,000 households represent less than 1% of all the city households. But it's still, 25,000 households. At 2.5 people per household, we're talking about a lot of people. Right? So, HPD also deals with code enforcement. Again, those houses that are deficient or not, whether you have heat and hot water, whether you have rats and mice, whether you have cockroaches in the apartment, whether you have a leaky roof. This is the city agency that deals with that. We have the Office of Development. Somebody mentioned gentrification. Well, this is the folks who actually decide what type of housing is going to be built in a particular area. City managed development, not necessarily privately managed development. We'll talk about that a little bit later. They deal with building and land development. They provide the tax incentive programs so that this can be built. They manage the low income tax credits that finance the construction of these developments. For instance, the buildings that you see going up around East Harlem, right? Site selection, which site are many of these developments going to be built on? They also deal with the tax foreclosure of HPD managed and owned property. NYCHA. It's another city agency, federally funded, federally mandated, that provides affordable housing. How to start here? Again, NYCHA represents 8.8% of all the rental units in the city. 8.8, 9%. 9%. Okay. The median contract rent is about $450. So it provides low rent housing. We also saw how a lot of their housing stock is subject to many physical deficiencies. And we'll talk about it in a few minutes. I'm going to go to another slide. We'll come back to NYCHA, spend a little bit of time on NYCHA, as to why this is the case and what are the plans that NYCHA has for what is going on presently. This is another very important city agency that anyone who is interested in housing or real estate development needs to know about. The Department of City Planning. So this is the agency that gives the big blueprints as to what is needed and how it is going to be managed. They work in close relationship with HPD and other city and state agencies. These are the people that actually start the process of development. Okay? They provide very many resources in this area, which is references, land use process, zoning. This is a very important city agency. It may sound boring. It may sound arcane. But it is precisely in those boring and arcane processes that the big issues are managed. We need to pay attention to them. We have to have an understanding of what goes on. A lot of what happens in the city is available for people to know. Many things happen behind closed doors, but ultimately everything has to come out in the open. When it comes out in the newspaper, it's already late. It's already been out in the process for maybe 2 years, maybe 5 years. All right? So if you're reading it in the newspaper, you're late to it. Okay? But there are ways in which we can know what type of development, what type of plans are in the works. a particularly important process that for you who are activists and the policymakers and people who want to influence policy need to know about is the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure. This is how land is used, to be redundant, in the city of New York. And it is a review process. And it involves the Department of City Planning. It involves something that should be accessible to you all, the community board. Do we know about the community board? Yes. And it's not the community board office. It's the community board as a governmental institution. It's the meetings that the community board holds. It's the board president. It's the City Planning Commission, which is different from the Department of City Planning. It is the City Council, and it is the mayor. Anything that has to do with city map changes, maps and provisions, special permits, housing and urban renewal plans, landfills, disposition of real property, acquisition of real property, site selection, everything has to be reviewed. So the community board knows about it, or should know about it. The borough president knows about it, or should know about it. It starts with the city planning department. It goes to the city planning. They all hold hearings. The the community board has 60 days to review a plan, 2 months. The borough president has 30 days. The city planning commission has 60 days. And then you have, again, the city council that has 50 days to review a plan. Right? So these are the agencies that deal with development. So if there is gentrification, or what has been termed gentrification in New York City, these all are the city agencies that have been involved in it. Natchez is not subject to this. We're going to leave Natchez aside. But all other private and public development has to go through this. Definitely public, private if it requires city subsidies or city lands or something of that nature. Yes?
I'm looking at this, and I'm also thinking about what you said before about since the housing emergency since 1965. And then I'm also thinking about like the plans I've seen for NYU to basically take over all of Manhattan. And it just doesn't make sense how there's not regulation on private, I mean, these are universities, but like to literally just take up all of this land at the same time there's a housing emergency. And does it have to go through this process? I mean, how does that work?
Well, in the case of NYU, and I do not know the case of NYU intimately, but if it involves zoning changes, meaning that they are planning buildings that are bigger than what zoning allows, it will have to go through this process. If it does not require it, if they can build as of right because they conform to all existing regulations, they don't have to go through this. You know, it is private property, if it is private property. In the case of NYU, as I understand it, it was paralyzed because it involved property that is used as parks, even though they're not parks. But it has to go through a review as a result. Okay?
How does eminent domain fit into this?
Eminent domain is very tricky. There is a constitutional right for government to take private property for a public use. That is a right, that is a constitutional right guaranteed to government. Federal government, state government, city government. What is public use? That is where a constitutional decision came out recently, where it was expanded. If the city leaders determined that you could give private property, you take it, the city takes it, the state takes it, and gives to another private property owner to develop, because in giving it to that other private developer, you're furthering a public good that was found to be constitutional. However, as a result of that decision, and I forget the name of the case right now, but it happened in Connecticut, there was a backlash that limited the number of private property that could be given to private developers for a quote-unquote public good. So there was even though there is a constitutional right to do that, there was also backlash, a political backlash, that prevented that from happening. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I sit in a community board, okay, and we have turned down changes in zoning for private entrepreneurs. And before we know it, they came up and they actually got the zoning changed without the community board's approval. How is that possible?
If they own the property outright,
yes.
If they conform to zoning resolution regulations, they do not need to go before a community board or the city planning commission or the board president.
What agency would allow them to change zoning?
It would be the Department of City Planning, or what could happen is that they could go to the Board of Standards and Appeals. The Board of Standards and Appeals is a city agency that can review and make an exception to existing zoning, provided a number of criteria, not willy-nilly, although many of the decisions have been willy-nilly. But they do need to, more than willy-nilly, pro forma. But there have been cases where zoning resolution exemptions have been denied because people in the community have gone and advocated before the Board of Standards and Appeals and said no. But for this reason, that reason, you need to meet the guidelines. All right, back there. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Alan, and I'm looking at this.
Speak up.
My name's Alan. I'm from Southeast Queens, and I'm looking at this. I feel like we need to have a discussion on public versus private because there seems to be such a problematic issue. Like, how could NYU call themselves a private college but receive public funds? And then you have, I go to John Jay. I'm a recent graduate from John Jay. And down the block from our school is these 2 luxury condos that are empty, and they're not paying any taxes on them. So I'm watching people in my neighborhood get kicked out of their houses. People who have lived there for 30, 40 years being kicked out. But then you have these developers who build these buildings that are empty, nothing going on. So how do we address that?
Political question, it's a political question, there's a political answer to that.
Don't answer.
Right. Organize, advocate, and agitate. And, Jaime reminds me that for those skills, there will be other workshops that will assist in organizing and preparing for advocating and agitating. And I suggest that you follow the Latino Leadership Initiative.
That's what we do.
That's
it.
Agitate.
That's it. Get
results. I want to take a couple more questions, but I really want to get to Nacha. So, yeah.
So I have two-part question. So the first thing is, hello, testing. So the first thing is, given this process that we have here, right? That's the way it's officially supposed to happen. Do you have example, of cases that the community board or elected officials can actually be duped into approving something that they thought that maybe had something good, but then later on ended up being part of like a gentrification project, and then
The whole Lower East Side.
And then the other thing is, what is the actual definition of gentrification? Because I hear the word being thrown around, but gentrification is actually a specific thing that happens. So like, for example, like 2 days ago, I saw an article, I think it was on Political, one of these sites, where it said, is gentrification good? And so just by knowing the definition of gentrification, you can never say that it's good, because it means the actual displacement of entire groups of people. Or that's my understanding. What is the official definition of gentrification?
Let me just say that it is 11:42. And this session goes until noon, and I will stay here a little bit after to answer more questions. But 18 minutes is not enough to answer a question on the definition of gentrification of the process. I will try to address some components of it a little bit later on in the presentation, but let's say that there is not one definition of gentrification. Okay? One question here.
You were talking about how you can go before the Board of Standards and Appeals. You said you could go to the Board of Standards and Appeals, right? And you can sit on the community board and go through the uniform land use process and all of that. Is there some way besides agitation, advocacy, and all of those sorts of things whereby our neighborhoods can use some of these access points, as they say in the medical field, to inoculate us in a form of prophylaxis against things like gentrification and market distortions and so on?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we need to be knowledgeable about information, and this is part of the process. Attending workshops like this to understand vaguely. I'm just giving you the rudimentary knowledge on how, on issues of housing or what have you. If you want to know how the system works, you really have to pay more close attention to it. One way to start at the community level is to attend community board meetings. They may be boring, or not. Sometimes they're very interesting. They may be arcane, but they are part of how the city functions and how these decisions are made. There is a New York City newspaper called the City Record. The City Record is a very interesting newspaper. It is put out daily. It's been in publications for 141 years. And it lists all the meetings that are held by city agencies at all levels. It lists procurement contracts. It lists when there are civil service examinations. It also lists whenever they hire or somebody retires from city government, it lists their name and salary. All of this information is readily available. I'll show you a little bit later on how to get this. You can get it online. Okay. I actually, one more question, and we'll continue later on. Go ahead.
Yes. For the sake of some people who have asked me, because I sit on the board of directors where I live, is there any particular document that can be identified? Because I've been told as well, and I've heard people say, don't sign anything when they give it to you in terms of that gentrification. Is there any particular document you can identify and tell me of something that shouldn't be signed? People don't read the fine print on things. Do you have any knowledge of that?
There is not one document that will tell you that. But there's a type of person who can tell you about that is a lawyer. For instance, we have our esteemed director here, Jaime Estades, who can answer questions on law regarding state and federal law. Okay? Let me proceed. So I still want to get back to NYCHA. I haven't forgotten about that. These are some of the resources that are available. These are some of the places where I have gone to get the information that I presented here today. These are readily available. The Housing and Vacancy Survey. I've only given you a glimpse. That survey is 700 pages long. All right? But it is available. Right? And part of the issue perhaps is that there is a lot of information, and sometimes it is hard to digest. Which is why I've only highlighted some of the things that I think are more relevant to our community. Right? But there is a lot of information that I have to just skip because it's just too much. Right? Obviously, the Rents Guidelines Board is a very important institution, particularly for those of you who are under rent control and rent stabilization. HPD has an annual plan. I'm sorry, you should have read NYCHA, not HPD, although HPD also has an annual plan. But NYCHA is mandated by law by the 1998 Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act to put out an annual plan telling HUD what it is that it is planning to do. NYCHA cannot keep secret if it's going to do something. Public housing authorities are supposed to disclose everything they plan to do the next year and the year after that. Okay, and we'll show you that annual plan to get some information about NYCHA. Okay. The City Planning Commission provides community district profiles, which I will use to illustrate perhaps this issue of gentrification a little bit, right? HUD also provides area median income data. So these are some of the resources, not the only resources, just some of the resources that I have used for today's presentation, okay? So you can get this data yourself.
We're going to send all that to all of you, hopefully today or tomorrow. Yeah, the whole PowerPoint.
We'll get it today after class.
Cindy knows more than
Along with the evaluation, we'd appreciate you all to fill out too.
So, let's go to NYCHA. Just quickly, since this came out, this is how HUD, I mean, in the previous income guidelines, I showed that for 2013, the area median income for the New York City area was $63,000, right? These are the guidelines for 2014. And it shows that for New York City, the area median income right here is $500 less, $62,500, okay? As a result of the recession. And it shows you how, for a family, I think this is family of 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, very low income is, extremely low income is $25,000. Okay? NYCHA. So here's where you get the annual plan. You go to NYCHA, you go to About NYCHA, and you see annual plan. Go read it, it's informative, right? And you come down here and it tells you where they have meetings about this annual plan. Okay? So what does the annual plan tell us? Right now, there are 170,000 families waiting to go into NYCHA development. And it only turns over about 3% every year. Okay? So these are people who have applied to NYCHA for the year 2014. The vast majority of these folks are African American and Hispanic. So there's a great need in our communities for this type of housing. Right? Now this is for public housing. For Section 8, we have 123,000 families that are in a waiting list to get a Section 8 voucher, right? The turnover is 8%. So it moves a little bit faster, but still very slow. And again, 30% of African Americans, 44% of Hispanics are overrepresented in this list. Okay? Why is NYCHA in the condition that it is? Right now, there has been a concern that right now some of the land NYCHA is using is selling it to contractors. And there is a plan for NYCHA to use some of that land to build housing on. And it is telling you what type of housing it is going to be using, right? They're telling us, however, that they're doing it because they don't have enough money to run their operating expenses and their capital expenses. Let me just go through this first and I'll answer some questions in a moment. It tells us that it has been underfunded by $750 million over the past 10 years because the federal government has been cutting funding for the operating side of things. In addition to that, from the capital side, the one operating funds is the one that is used to pay the salaries of NYCHA employees to go pick up the garbage, change the light bulbs, manage the administration office, right? Perhaps buy the light bulbs. But the capital fund is the one that's being used to replace windows, replace piping, fix the roof, fix the elevators, and they have been underfunded by $875 million. And this is true. There is federal law, the 1998 Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act, substantially limited funding available to public housing authorities throughout the country. And let me tell you something. When you compare to other public housing agencies around the country, NYCHA is probably the top performing agency. Comparatively, okay?
Wow.
Wow, yes. The federal government, this is a law passed by the Congress, a Republican Congress, signed by Bill Clinton, the Democratic president, where it says, among other things, it says many things, not one penny of federal funds can be used to add to the existing stock of public housing units. The federal government is out of providing additional housing units of public housing. Okay? And they have in fact been cutting down on the money that comes from Washington to provide for public housing. And that's not to say that the state government has stepped in or that the city has stepped in. As a result, NYCHA is proposing to use some of the land that is used for parking garages, parking lots, or other open areas to, in fact, lease it to private developers to build this, so far they're proposing to sell, to rather lease 14 parcels of land in 8 developments to create new residential buildings. That is their plan. And it tells us, this is what they're telling us. I'm not vouching for NYCHA. I'm just telling you what NYCHA is telling HUD. Okay? That it will not increase the rent for residents, it will not demolish public housing apartments, it will not displace NYCHA families, it will not privatize public housing. Okay? It will not sell NYCHA land. Now, NYCHA does have a right to do all of those things. It does have the right. The federal law allows NYCHA to reduce the number of public housing. It gives NYCHA the right to sell land. NYCHA is not saying that it is going to do. In fact, it's telling you that it's not going to do. But it is going to lease these 14 parcels in these 8 developments to make up, in those proceeds, make up for the deficit that NYCHA claims that they have in terms of an operating fund and capital fund. Okay? One more point. It also says, well, you can read what the benefit, what NYCHA states what the benefits are. Give me a minute there to look at that. It is also telling us that in terms of the new marketplace, this is the former Mayor Bloomberg's plan was, NYCHA does plan to sell, not lease, sell property here in the Bronx to the New York Schools Construction Authority, okay, to build a school, okay? It's also telling us that in the Bronx, in High Beach Gardens, it will also sell, or have sold a land to develop 155 units of housing. Right here, it is Harlem. I think that, here we go. Washington Houses, down the street. he sold the property to Harlem RBI to create a charter school and housing. So NYCHA has the right to sell land, and he has done it, or he's planning on doing it. But he has to tell HUD that it will do it. And in preparing this document, he has to tell NYCHA residents through the resident council what his plans are. And it involves NYCHA residents through the resident council in the process. So the resident council is a means of participating in this planning process. To say nothing of approaching your federal elected officials in advocating for the federally funded and federally mandated public housing. Okay? I'm going to take a question here. Okay?
Yes, let me answer.
You get somebody answer? One question back there?
Hi. I would like to know, now that we have an overall idea of housing situation, you as an expert, what would you suggest to the elected officials? What kind of public policy should they work on? And also we as a community and as individuals, what should we demand or how should we approach?
The easy and facile answer is, well, provide more housing, right? But it's almost like a flippant answer, right? How do we go about providing more housing? I mean, one thing is that we need to select the land where the housing is supposed to take place. I mean, and land is one of the most expensive components of providing housing. And this is why one of the ways the previous administration was going about doing it is by rezoning sites that were formerly industrial or commercial and making it either mixed or residential, right? Money is needed to provide for housing, and money is running dry. We live in a political environment where we do not want to pay more taxes. In fact, the pressure is to reduce the amount of taxes that are collected. So how can you build housing? Do you then rely on the private sector? The private sector is very good at providing housing, but not for the lower end of the market. It just does not pay. There is a lot of construction. There's a lot of high-rise being built. There's a lot of low-rises being built that sell for many millions of dollars. And there are people lining up to buy it. Right? So the housing at the high end is not a problem, it's at the low end, but for that money is needed. Or tax incentives may be needed. And state subsidies and city subsidies and federal government subsidies. How is that going to come about? You need to change the political equation so that elected officials that may be more amenable to providing for housing at the lower end of the spectrum are in a position to make that decision. And again, I think there will be workshops on how to provide interested folks like you with the skills on how to go about making that happen. Okay. Right over here? Yes.
Yes, thank you. Can you talk about the thank you. Can you talk about the bill that NYCHA has been receiving annually from the City of New York for police protection, NYPD, and sanitation?
No, I can't. I don't have that knowledge. For what I read in the press, NYCHA had its own transit bureau, its own housing bureau that went into the police department, but they still charged NYCHA for that protection. Again, NYCHA is a city agency, but it's not a regular city agency. It's a city agency that is a part, it's an authority, and therefore provisions by another city agency are charged against NYCHA. Okay? So, but I cannot speak beyond those comments. Over here?
Can you repeat the name of that law that you mentioned?
Yes, the 1998 Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act. These are federal laws that came about when, they ended welfare as we know it. There was a question in the back.
it was determined late last September that NICA actually had a surplus of over $1 billion. And it was kind of like kicked to the curb, this plan of selling off to private developers, because they're actually operating with a surplus. Are you aware of that? Or?
Let's see. Nice. The plan actually talks about what its operating budget is, but I don't have it. I would have to look through it. Apparently, NYCHA was holding on to, this is what was reported in the press, I don't know, that it was holding to a few $1 million in capital funding. I still don't think that that speaks to the deficit that they have in both their operating funds or the capital funding. It means that they just haven't done the construction they needed to do, the repairs they needed to do. And we know that that is the case because NYCHA is overrepresented in the type of rental units that have physical deficiencies. So we know that too. Yes, ma'am.
Can a private property owner come into a community and build a building that's for just anyone to rent at a high rent and not include the heat, but receive government assistance?
That doesn't sound right. I mean, a private owner, a private developer can come in on a piece of private land and build a development that they can rent at whatever the market bears. But I think that there are housing code regulations that require basic amenities such as heat and hot water. Whether they charge the tenant for that, that may be part of that gross rent as opposed to the contract rent. That may be different. Back over here, red shirt here.
Going back to the uniform land use procedure, the ULURP, that was a procedure you put up there, like roofing and all the procedures, community boards, and so forth. My question to you is, can eminent domain override that?
I would suspect that eminent domain would be part of that process. I think that a piece of property that goes through eminent domain would have to go through that process. I suspect, I don't know for a fact. Question over here.
Yes, the ground rent that the ground rent that NYCHA is proposing is like land value taxation. Now, there's a lot of empty land in private owners. Wouldn't land value taxation will prevent any land speculation, because there's a lot of empty land and there's a lot of empty buildings?
And it has also been the policy of the city of New York to provide a lot of tax incentives in order to promote the development of both low income, middle income, and high income building. So even though there may be a lot of vacant land, there's also land that was formerly vacant that is not drawing in taxes because they are provided as a subsidy. Back here.
So just wanted to point out, the deficit has been widely disputed. The leasing, the renting is actually for 99 years, but beyond that...
what agency are you referring to?
NYCHA. Okay. But more, I wanted to ask about community land trust, part of a case study in East Harlem that was, we're looking into that as an alternative for affordable housing. I don't know if you have time to...
I have the time, I don't have the knowledge on the community land trust. But I do want to address quickly before we end, since it's already past noon, the issue about gentrification and development or what have you, perhaps. Let me just, this was a, we are here in East Harlem. East Harlem is part of Community Board 11, Community District 11. And we see that between 2000 and 2010, the population increased by 2.4%. Who came in? The non-Hispanic white population increased by 70%. The non-Hispanic black population decreased by 11%. The Asian non-Hispanic population increased by 111%. Hispanics decreased by 3.3%, right? Now, most of the people that left were children, which implies families, right? And most of the people that came in tended to be younger folks, particularly those of working age. Some of these are empty nesters, perhaps, people who are between 45 and 64 years of age, or who have, if they have still children in the house, they tend to be teenagers. And then younger folks, right? So the number of people increased by 2%, the number of households increased by almost 9%. The number of housing units increased by 9%. So there were more units, the increase was higher for the number of units available than the number of households that increased in the same period. It's a good development. There was not as much pressure for the existing housing stock. Right? We're not talking about rents. We're just talking about the number of units available. Right? Now, if you compare that to our neighboring district, Central Harlem's district, Community District 10, we see that the population increased by 8%. So, more population growth in Central Harlem than in East Harlem, right? From 2% to 8% comparison. The number of households, however, was about the same, an 8% growth. However, the total number of housing units only increased by 4%. So there is more pressure in Central Harlem for the existing housing stock than there is in East Harlem, because more housing stock was built in East Harlem than in Central Harlem. Relative, definitely, I mean, in absolute terms, and then relative in terms of the proportion of how the population grew. It grew faster in Central Harlem than in East Harlem. Who were the people that went into Central Harlem? 400% non-Hispanic whites. So the number of non-Hispanic whites quadrupled in this period. The number of African Americans was reduced by 12%. Asians by, doubled. 43% Hispanics. Who was living also? Again, likely families, because children are underrepresented in those who left, right? And who are coming in? Again, younger folks and perhaps some empty nesters. This is telling us, and to address the issue of gentrification perhaps, gentrification often is understood to be that you have people of higher income, usually associated with non-Hispanic whites, moving into the neighborhood. But does ethnicity make a difference? I mean, right now, if you go around East Harlem, you have a lot of people who are Hispanics who are moving into El Barrio, who have much more income than the area median income, and certainly more income than the district's median income. Is that not still gentrification?
Yeah.
And however, it was not the policy, and it was actually the policy of the city of New York, to diversify a community, because it was understood that having concentrated poverty was not good public policy. How do you diversify and deconcentrate poverty? People with more income come in, people with less income move out. What is part of the issue? But it's displacement, yes. But is it direct displacement? Many of the units that were newly built were built in vacant land. Land that at some point had displaced their residents, perhaps decades ago. Because we still know there are few vacant lands out there. it was built, new people coming. There has been a lot of indirect displacement. People who 20, 30 years ago could skip a month or two of rent, and the landlord would not kick you out because it's more expensive to kick you out than to just forego those 2 months of rent. Now they do have an incentive to kick you out because they can jack up the rent. If they haven't touched that apartment in 30 years, they can come in, fix up the apartment. One way to jack up the rent in a rent-stabilized apartment is to say, I spent so much money in fixing this apartment, so instead of getting $700 in rent, I can get $1,800 in rent because of all the capital expenditures in fixing up this apartment. So, is there displacement? There is displacement, mostly indirect, not always necessarily direct. Okay? It has been the public policy of the City of New York to diversify the economy of different districts, particular districts that have been poor. There has not been a commensurate policy to diversify the socioeconomic makeup of high-end districts. That is something that we can also talk about. How can that be accomplished? It's 11:45. I think we're going to end it up here. I'll linger for about 5 minutes or 10 minutes.
And then one quick announcement, First of all, let's give a rounding of applause. I hope that's something we can walk away with these sessions. So also, let's give each other a round of applause for empowering ourselves, empowering our work, empowering our communities as we share this. One quick thing is I'm going to send after class within the hour the evaluation email. Please, please, please take a moment to fill it out. Your input is invaluable to us. This is a pilot program which we hope to further develop, but we need to know how to make it an actual quality resource. The other thing is, please check out our website, LatinoLeadershipInstitute.net. LatinoLeadership.net is where we're going to put some gold for you. What's the gold? Well, not real gold, because I need that. But what we're going to do is, we're going to put this video, which we recorded in the back, we're going to be putting it on the website. Knowledge is power, so we want to give that to you all. So LatinoLeadershipInstitute.net. The PowerPoint is also going to be emailed. The PowerPoint from last week we're still waiting to get because the professor is in DC. So as soon as he comes back, he just wanted to revise it to make it more up to date for you all. And then we're going to get it. Anyways, much love to you all. Have a wonderful weekend. See you at 10 a.m. sharp. By that I mean see you at 9:30. So you'll get here by 10 a.m. sharp next week. There's class next week on healthcare. You'll get an email. No, not next week.
Going to the pockets.
Hold on, let me get your number. What's interesting to see is like, because so we started off by saying like, in the city, specifically,
If not, that's
or even nationwide, guarantees. Yeah. So,
I'm sure you're one. I feel like really that's every country but us at this point.
Class next week, no class.
I know, that's what I'm like, you're thinking in Spanish.
I mean, I go downtown. I eventually got to make it through.
Are you guys getting chills?
Yeah.
I know. These last years,
no, I'm not.
Have a good day. Have a good class.
My son was like,
no class. Oh, the following. Okay. But we're going to send you the information.
I know, right?
Thank you.
transition with the
And this is a pilot program. So this is a just write it out and bring it to me next week.
I know what's happening.
So you but I need one of
after you leave college, job placement, like you get hired very soon.
Yeah, that was good. Cornell was good.
If I could go outside.
You know, I mean, I love
So we're happy to figure out how to get people on a newsletter from like now they can hear about like this, how people can come in and do this, how we can get in contact with them. You know, Jaime, our director, is always traveling, he's always wherever he wants to like come in and do that. We're very comfortable, so let us know what you need. Everybody's committed, we're committed. So this is a pilot program. This is now here is a pilot program. I want to know how to figure it out. Because it's like not just like a quick opener. I know, we'll take one so you go out.